Well, first of all, pour commencer, toutes mes félicitations sincères aux organisateurs pour leur organisation impeccable de ce colloque. C'est un colloque fort intéressant. Je vais utiliser le principe qu'on applique dans les réunions belges, c'est-à-dire chacun parle sa langue. Moi, je vais parler en anglais, si vous voulez bien m'excuser. En flamand, non. Pas pour l'instant, sauf si vous insistez. I will also try to be a little bit brief because I notice in the audience what I would like to call the elbow phenomenon. The elbow phenomenon starts, and I see the elbows disappearing now, but it actually starts to, become very apparent at the second day of a colloquium when people are a bit tired and sometimes they need two elbows to continue to be following the discussion. So, I'll try to be brief. Provisional application has always been of enormous interest to me. I find it fascinating. Because it is this really, pragmatic way of bringing treaties to life in sometimes extremely difficult circumstances. My favorite example in the course on the WTO that I teach in Leuven is, of course, the GATT, where you have these 47 years of provisional application, which were extremely inventive, which were extremely problematic, of course. Think about the non-approval by any parliament, except in Haiti. Think about the problem that, what was the legal status of those agreements in the domestic legal systems, the institutional problematique of GATT and the surrounding, institutional build-up that was generated in Geneva after a couple of years. So, there are lots of interesting things about provisional application, and we will not be able to touch upon them all here. There is, of course, also the Vienna Convention, Article 25. I will not really touch upon that. I will restrict myself to EU practice, the question of the involvement of the European Parliament, and, well, let's say the pathological hypothesis that a member state would refuse to ratify a mixed agreement, and what would happen then. I would normally not have touched upon it, but I noticed that the third speaker is not with us, so I hope you are free to touch on it. So, it's obvious provisional application is a very important part of EU treaty practice. And, of course, it's needed because just imagine that we wouldn't have this instrument and that we would have to wait until all member states also ratify a mixed agreement. Think of the FTA with Korea, which basically was signed in October 2010 and only entered into force on 13 December 2015, 5 years. But there is worse in the European practice. The EEC Agreement on Cooperation and Customs Union with San Marino took more than 10 years to enter into force. Signed in 1991, entered into force 2002. And it's clear that there, if you have an EU-only agreement, of course, things can be basically handled in a couple of months. When we look at CETA, for instance, the Council signed on the 30th of October 2016. The European Parliament gave its consent only 3.5 months later, 15th of February 2017. So if it is an EU-only agreement, it's obvious that this can go very, very quick indeed. Now, so it's a very useful technique, but it is, of course, a technique that can lead to certain problems. There may be all kinds of tricks and techniques by member states to try to maximize their bargaining power, even in the situation of the approaching prior provisional application decision. I think back of what happened with, say, the South Africa Development and Cooperation Agreement. Shortly before the starting date of the provisional application of the agreement, Italy threatened not to ratify and argued that its refusal would also preclude the provisional application. Greece joined Italy. Eventually, they all fell back in line after having extracted further concessions from South Africa. So, you can use that as a bargaining chip, of course. Think also of the problematic of Ukraine. It has been touched upon already, this remarkable referendum in the Netherlands, and then this also remarkable decision of the heads of state or government of the 28 member states meeting within the European Council. I like those formulas, you know, that basically had to answer some of the concerns of Dutch voters. And then there is, of course, the CETA saga, where, you know, you have new stars like Paul Maillet becoming world famous. He's now giving lectures everywhere. So, I mean, I'm sure you, sooner or later, you will have him in Rennes, in Paris, whatever. So, I mean, yes, it's a very charismatic speaker besides, and in Geneva he was recently. But so, I mean, yes, the question there, of course, is what does this mean, these recent hiccups? And then, to be honest, in the Council, some, as part of the CETA negotiations, there were some confusing statements by a couple of member states. Germany, Austria, Poland, Belgium. And then in the Council, say, les notules of the meeting, the actual report of the meeting, you also have some confusing statements. So it's all pretty confusing right now. That's why the title of our paper is Provisional Application in stormy times, okay, turbulent times, stormy times, whatever. And the opinion 215 of the European Court, in a certain way, also adds to part of the confusion, I think. Now, let me point generally to some aspects of EU practice. There is, of course, Article 218, paragraph 5 of the TFEU, where the Council, as it says, on a proposal of the negotiator, adopts a decision authorizing the signing, and if necessary, the provisional application before the entry into force. We know that in practice the Council has some leeway there. It may decide on, it may take a decision on signature and provisional application in one single decision, as it has done, for instance, in the South Korea FTA case. But it can also split it up in two decisions, two separate decisions, as it has done in the CETA case. And then you can, of course, still have variations. In the past, it was more the practice to make a separate agreement with regard to provisional application. But that practice has evolved a little bit. A question which is one of my favorite exam questions in my course at the College of Europe is, just imagine you are working for the European Parliament and the Council decides on provisional application. What's the role of the European Parliament in that stage of the treaty-making process? It's very tricky, because then you have to look at, of course, at Article 218 and so on and so forth. But what I find very interesting is not so much what the treaty says, but what the actual practice has become with the European Parliament. The European Parliament, indeed, has requested quite a number of times in the past that FTAs would not be provisionally applied before the Parliament would have given its consent. That was the case with the EU-Korea FTA, where the Council adopted the decision on signing a provisional application, and the provisional application only applied as of 1st of July 2011, after the European Parliament had given its consent on 17th of February 2011. And indeed, the Parliament is good at extracting such commitments, especially from commissioner-elects. Can you imagine Karel de Gucht in 2010 coming to the European Parliament, being grilled and so on? And they, of course, extracted a commitment, a promise from him that the Commission would wait for the Parliament's consent before it would propose the EU-Korea FTA to be provisionally applied. There have been a couple of other instances where the Parliament has asked for it, and in fact, there's been also this hearing with Cecilia Malmström in 2014, where they more or less forced her to commit herself that for basically all trade agreements and trade chapters in association agreements, she would take a commitment to not request provisional application before the Parliament would give its consent. And she has made that commitment. It's on record. There's a whole declaration here. I'm sorry that I'm so old-fashioned that I don't have those beautiful technological skills to show you that declaration, but it's there and it's in our paper. It's very interesting because even that rather strong commitment is not enough for the Parliament. The Parliament wants this to be laid down in an interinstitutional agreement. Of course. So there are interesting statements. For instance, there is a resolution of the 5th of July 2016 on a new forward-looking and innovative future strategy for trade and investment, where the Parliament has indeed insisted on this interinstitutional agreement in this respect. Okay, good. So the practice is far more, say, advanced than what Article 218, paragraph 5 seems to imply. Now about the scope of provisional application. I've always been intrigued by this question. How far can you go in provisional application? For the EU part, and then what does it mean for European Union competence? Yes, for European competence as such, or only for European Union exclusive competence. There's a lot of discussion in the literature, there's a lot of things in practice, and there is the recent opinion 215, where the court held that parts of the EU-Singapore FTA that fell within the shared competences, and I quote, cannot be approved by the European Union alone. So it would appear that the EU can only conclude an international agreement on its own without the participation of member states, where it falls entirely within the exclusive competence. Now, if that is so, then it must be that as a matter of EU law, the EU can also only undertake to provisionally apply those parts of an agreement that are covered by its exclusive competence. So, shared competences, exclusive competences of member states, one would say normally an act of member states would be required. But again, practice is diverse. EU-Colombia was mentioned, and so on. Then the other question is, of course, what does the EU do with regard to the full application, or rather a partial application of certain international agreements? I found it very interesting that the European Commission, with regard to CETA, proposed to give provisional application to the agreement in its entirety, in spite of having agreed, be it reluctantly and grudgingly, to the signature of the agreement as a mixed agreement. But the Council's final decision on provisional application of CETA, in the end, excluded from provisional application those parts of CETA that the member states were saying is not covered by EU exclusive competence. And there's even a recital added to the preamble of that decision that clarifies that only parts of the agreement falling within the competence of the Union may be applied on a provisional basis. Okay. There's also this practice under the recent association agreements which provide for partial provisional application. A nice example is the EU-Moldova association agreement. Why is it a nice example? Because it makes so patently clear that those provisions give actually the right only to one party, notably the European Union, to decide which parts of the agreement will be provisionally applied. Moldova apparently has no say in that decision. Quite interesting. Similar or more or less identical provisions you find in the association agreements with Ukraine and Georgia. Okay, there are a couple of things in our paper that I skip, but let's now, if we may, and my time is probably up, focus still on this question of, well, pathology. A member state refuses to ratify. That risk is always there. It's as such remarkable that it hasn't happened yet. So it would be a very interesting area for research, I think, to see what formal and informal, legal and de facto mechanisms, pressure tools and so on, the EU and other member states have to convince a member state to really ratify, if, well, sometimes with delays, but still to ratify a certain mixed agreement. But so, as I already mentioned, there have been threats in the past. I mentioned this case of Italy that threatened in 1999 not to ratify this mixed agreement with South Africa. Okay. Now, we have a certain thesis in our paper, according to which, absent a clause to that effect in the agreement, a member state's expressed refusal to become a party cannot prevent the EU from starting to provisionally apply the agreement. even where the agreement cannot go into force absent that member state's ratification, which is typically the case for the EU's mixed agreements. And by the same token, a member state's notification that it will not join the agreement, in our view, will not discontinue the provisional application of the agreement by the EU. For that to happen, action by the EU would be required. So the Council would need to adopt a decision to terminate the provisional application of the agreement, and that decision would need to be notified to the other parties in accordance with the provisions of the agreement regulating the termination of its provisional application. I have the impression that this is also the European Commission's position. Our colleague from the Legal Service is not with us anymore, but I have a reference here to a session before the European Parliament's INTA committee, where the Deputy Director General of DG Trade, Mr. Mauro Petriccione, stated, soon after the signature of CETA, and I quote, "Member states cannot stop the application of a union agreement, cannot stop provisional application unilaterally." End of quote. That being said, there's also the question of whether, as a matter of EU law, a member state's refusal to ratify an agreement would also have detrimental effects with regard to the continued provisional application of a treaty. And it's a pity in a way that our colleague, who for very legitimate reasons is not with us in this session, that he's not here because he has written an article together with our colleague and friend Ramses Wessel in Common Market Law Review, and I quote, they suggested that the failure of the ratification procedure would require the termination of the provisional application. And you find some support for that position in a statement that the Council made. I mentioned already the confusion that reigned in that whole CETA episode. Well, the Council in that meeting made a statement that reads as follows, if I may just quote from it. If the ratification of CETA fails permanently and definitively because of a ruling of a constitutional court, or following the completion of other constitutional processes and formal notification by the government of the concerned state, provisional application must be and will be terminated. That statement was later echoed also by Mr. Petriccione before the INTA committee. But I believe that there is no real reason to think that this is a legal requirement and that the institutions were thinking that this was a legal requirement on the EU to discontinue the provisional application. It is certainly true that the entry into force provisions found in many of the EU's mixed agreements require that all parties ratify the agreement before it can enter into force. But one member state's failure to ratify, in our view, does not necessarily mean that the agreement has failed permanently to enter into force, notwithstanding that quoted statement from the Council. It is conceivable that a member state which initially notified its intention of not ratifying the agreement can be subsequently persuaded to revisit that position. The whole history of European integration is littered with those cases of, making sure, giving incentives, all kinds of, empty declarations, promises, kickbacks, I don't know what. Remember the Edinburgh summit at the end of 1992 after the first Danish nay to the Maastricht Treaty and so on. The whole European integration history is littered with those ways in which you can make member states revisit their initial refusal, And that actually also happened with that case of Italy and Greece, remember, with the South Africa agreement in 1999. So I think, and we take the view in our paper that we don't believe that the EU is under an obligation to terminate the provisional application of a mixed agreement where it becomes apparent that a member state will not be able to ratify. I would be inclined to develop a little bit on certain issues regarding provisional application. I gave the example of the GATT, which was extreme, of course, but just imagine that indeed you are in a situation in the EU where you would have a member state more or less permanently saying, we're not doing it, we're just not doing it. Then the question is, what do you do about it? Well, I would say provisional application is there, you apply the treaty, fine. I mean, those parts of the treaty that are EU competence. In the GATT case, I would, of course, have said this is problematic because it lacks any form of democratic legitimacy. No parliament has been able to speak out. In the case of provisional application, given the practice that I have just described to you, there is actually, in that sense, not a problem of democratic legitimacy, because in our hypothesis, the European Parliament would have given its consent already. So at that European level, there would not be a democratic legitimacy kind of problem. But then, of course, the question is, in the long run, just imagine that a member state is persistently and continuously saying no, no, no. What will it mean? Well, then we develop a couple of hypotheses and scenarios in our paper, which I will be happy to develop further, but I think my time is now up, so I would like to thank you for your attention.